making a good podcast is what's hard. And it's the same with writing a book. You think writing the book is the hard part. It's not. Getting people to read it is the hard part. Making a podcast is really not that hard when you look back on it. But getting people to listen to it, that's where all the effort comes into play.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
And we're back with the podcast on podcasting. It's your host, Adam A. Adams. You all know that this show is here to set you apart, to make sure that you can grow your audience, grow your listener base, grow your influence, make more money, hopefully with your podcast as well. And today I've got someone that I had met about 6 months ago now at the podcast movement. However, that's just in person. I've been following this guy online for a while. He's got some really good things to say. And I think that as a podcaster, you're going to be learning a few things that are going to help you be a better podcaster. And that's what this episode's all about. Dave, how are you today?
Dude, I am ready to talk some podcasting. Glad to be here.
How's the weather where you are, Dave?
It's wait 10 minutes, it'll change. I went from like 2 feet of snow. I know why you're doing this. 2 feet of snow in my backyard. I could see my grass, and now we're back to snow.
Love it. Love it. So Dave's got maybe a couple of pet peeves, and one of them is the weather. So yeah. I had to do that to him. I had to. Dave, we started just a minute or two ago in the pre-interview, and you had some good stuff that you wanted to pour into a new podcaster. Your bio is already in our show notes, so the listener can just scroll down, grab your bio. That's all there. And the link to your podcast is already in the show notes, so they can just scroll down. Let's start where you and I were just talking, because that was getting somewhere really good, and I wanted to make sure it was recorded.
Sure. When it comes to a new podcaster, my bumper sticker answer is spend $100 on a microphone, spend 100 hours getting to know your customer, right? Your potential listener. Because if you know your potential listener, then you're not worried about that first episode because you know what they want, right? If I know that somebody loves the Philadelphia Eagles football team and I go buy a Philadelphia Eagles jersey, I'm not nervous giving that to them as a present. And so what's funny is I hang out in these different groups and Reddits and things like that, and everybody asks for feedback on their artwork and, hey, can you listen to my audio? I'm using a $300 microphone. Should I use a $400 microphone? No. All this feedback, but nobody ever says, hey, can you listen to my content and tell me if it's good? And what's interesting about this is normally, this is the other pet peeve. So let's say it's a Facebook group. And I'm like, all right, you know what? I got 10 minutes. I'll go over and listen to it. I'll click on the person's name, then say, show me their profile. I'll go to the about or contact or whatever it is on Facebook. And there's no link to their website. So now it's like, hey, you had a potential listener. Nope. But nobody says, listen to my content. And there's a show I watch on MSNBC. It's called The Prophet, and it's got the typical billionaire, and he comes around and helps small businesses. And I remember there was one, it was a clothing store, and he said, well, who's your target market? And they're like, oh, kind of, 30-year-old moms or something like that. And he's like, okay, well, how did they react when you did a focus group? And they're like, focus what? Huh? And so he got their top selling line, which wasn't really selling that well, and brought in a bunch of their target audience, and their target audience went, I'd never wear that. And he's like, okay, I think I figured out why nobody's buying your clothing line. It's like, give me a break. And so now I understand why, because it's your first episode and it probably took you 10 hours to get it together in Audacity and the what format. So the last thing you want to do is go, hey, this is fresh out of the oven. Can you please rip it to shreds? And that's how people view it. Please rip this to shreds. And it's not, hey, can you tell me what I'm doing right so I can do more of this? And tell me those things that might need a little polishing because I want to do less of those. Because my favorite example, and this is from, I got to give him credit, Rob Walch from Libsyn brought up two movies. One was The Lone Ranger. This is back, I think, in the 90s with Johnny Depp at the height of his Johnny Deppness. Right. He's off of the pirate movies and he's playing Tonto in this movie. And I mean, they had the Happy Meals ready to go and the posters and the action fight. This was going to be the summer blockbuster. I saw that movie. It was horrendous. It was incredibly bad. And anybody that I talked to about that movie, I said, don't go see it. I love Johnny Depp, but that was bad. Meanwhile, there's a movie called The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis. And if you've never seen that movie, go watch it because it's really good. And I guarantee you, the minute you walk out of that movie theater, or in this case, watch it on whatever, you're going to go tell somebody else about it. In fact, I saw that movie twice. You have to see that movie twice, and I'm not going to spoil it, but you'll get it when you see it. And that movie had like half the budget, half the marketing thing, and it just went bonkers because it was great. So when you put a podcast out there that hasn't had a focus group of somebody not named Mom or Cousin Carl, all you're going to do, because I see people like, okay, I need to learn Facebook ads to promote my podcast. And I was like, whoa, hold on. Let's make sure the product works first. And they're ready to just blow tons of cash on Facebook ads. And I was like, should we make sure that it's good first? So that's something I just see a lot of. That I understand why we're excited, but don't you want to make sure? I'll give you a quick story. This is back when CD-ROMs were in computers, but I made a self-running CD-ROM and it was a resume. You put it in, it told you all about Dave Jackson. And at the end, it said it was a quiz. And it said, your next following step should be A, call and schedule an interview, B, call and schedule an interview, or C, call and schedule an interview. And it worked. I got a job. And everybody said, you should make these and sell these. So I bought a domain, I put it together, went to sell it. And then I looked at the competition and I was like, oh, apparently I'm not the genius that I thought I was. I never checked to see what the market is and who my target, all that stuff. And digitalresume.cc, I don't even know if they still make that, was a just giant flaming failure because I didn't get anybody else's feedback on it besides my friends and family who said, oh yeah, you need to do this. And so anytime you do a little recon of what's going on and just know what your audience wants, that's what's going to get them to share your show. They're like, oh my gosh, somebody was telling me about a show and then it's all about changing the world. And they had this whole thing. And I was like, you know what I love about that? It's not true crime. I was like, it's not a movie review show. So anytime you can do something different or you're providing information that you can't get anyplace else, that's check one is always a good thing to start with.
Yeah. Good stuff. I want to stick on this little idea here about like really serving your audience. So the first thing that you mentioned about your bumper sticker is it's spend $100 on a microphone and 100 hours trying to understand your listener, your avatar.
Yeah.
And I think that these ideas, like that one is identifying and understanding your avatar, like to the core, is a huge thing that a lot of people miss. You doing your recon, like your CD-ROM. And it's like there's so many people that start these things, but they haven't found a niche. They haven't found a unique spin on anything. They haven't drawn their line in the sand. And so I want to think about if I'm just a brand new podcaster or I'm about to start a podcast, what are kind of the steps that I take to spend 100 hours knowing my listener or doing my recon to make sure that I'm niching down?
Yeah. When you go to a Facebook group that in theory has your target audience, don't go in there guns a-blazing and saying, hey, I'm starting a new podcast. Just go in and listen. Marc Maron was at Podcast Movement and somebody asked him what makes a really good interview. And he said, oh, it's really easy. Listen. And so really, like you said, you're doing recon. So go in there and just listen to what they're talking about. And if you are doing a podcast as a marketing arm of your business, those questions that you go, if I have to answer, what's the best microphone under $100 again? Well, no, that's your first episode. And that second, all those questions, because in that particular kind of scenario, you end up with a better educated customer. And now you're ready to help the customer do that 202 stuff, not the 101 stuff. But some people go, I don't have an audience. So how do I do any kind of recon? Go to Facebook and look for 4-star reviews, not 5, and 2-star reviews, not 1. Why? Because 1-star reviews are, oh, that sucked. Okay, thanks. Thanks for the clarity. Can we be a little more vague? And likewise, 5-star reviews are like, this is the best thing since sliced bread, but they don't say why. A 4-star or a 2-star review will say, I was going to give this 5 stars, but they didn't do blank. And that's the part you go, okay, if I talk about that subject, I'm going to do this. Same thing with a 2-star review. I would have give this 1 stars, but at least they did such and such.
So I know I'm interrupting you. Is this like on Apple podcast reviews? Is that where you're saying?
No, Amazon. Because I see in Facebook groups, especially on a weekly basis, if not daily basis, and I don't get what's in it for these people. Tell me what your podcast is, and I'll write you a 5-star review. And I always go, again, going back to that thing, I think I've asked for reviews and things like that twice in almost 17 years, and I've got quite a few in there. If your content is not inspiring people to leave a review, and that's a red flag. That's a red flag. And so those of us that know what to look for, it's always kind of interesting because there are groups where it's like Follow Friday or something like that. And they all of a sudden you'll go in, like, well, that's really odd. On February 14th, this particular show got 7 5-star reviews, and they all say, love the show, great host. And you're like, okay, really? And 70%, according to Jacobs Media, 70% of podcasts are discovered via word of mouth. So that's people saying, like, I just had somebody today tell me about Murderville on Netflix. They're like, oh, have you seen Murderville yet? I'm like, no. And I'm like, oh, you got to watch it. It's got all these great people in it. It's hilarious. And I was like, all right, write it down. Next time I'm on Netflix, I'm going to check out Murdervilles.
Yeah. So you said don't check on Apple reviews, check on Amazon reviews about the podcast?
About the subject. So let's say I'm doing a show on NASCAR. If I'm doing a show on how to get fit after 50, I could go in and type in that. Use Amazon like a search engine. And if you want brutal reviews, go to YouTube, because people on YouTube will cut you at the knees to leave a review. They don't care. So if you go over there and you type in a subject, number one, you're going to see what subjects are doing well. So you'll see the titles of that. But when you go into those reviews, again, you're going to run into a bunch of like, best video ever. You're the best, Steve. And then you'll get some like, oh, this video is awful. But you will see people, it's like, oh, I really like this, but I wish you would have talked about such and such. So YouTube, any place that has reviews. And like I say, the only reason they say not Apple, and you can use Apple because they're fairly easy to tell a good review from we're looking for more than a sentence here. We're looking for details. So yeah, you could use Apple. Yeah. I don't want to completely just say it's not worth it, but there are a lot of really fake reviews in Apple. So,
okay. So this is a really good takeaway for another podcaster and for me as well, going to YouTube, because it's brutal. And you're absolutely right. Some people get a lot of traction and some don't. And some have kind of like a polarized feedback. But I like that idea of just kind of going in and seeing what is it that people are talking about it. What did that person miss? As we're doing our recon about our podcast content, that's a place that we can go to help make sure that we're getting really good content. Are there any other places like that you would suggest we go?
Reddit is another one that's just, boy, if you make the people on Reddit upset, it's pitchforks and torches. They just go brutal on people. But another YouTube trick is if you find a channel and there's a part of you that goes, oh, this person's actually kind of my competition. They're doing exactly what I want to do. Well, good, because go over to their videos and sort them by popularity, because you can see what's working and what's not. And so you can see where that last episode was like, wow, the other one's got X amount of views and this one got next to nothing. I'm like, okay, either A, cover this topic really poorly, or your audience could care less about that subject. So that's another kind of trick you can do with YouTube. But for me, the best thing you can do, and it's hard when you're in a pandemic, but anytime you can be around your target audience, that's the best. When you can tell me the eye color of your target audience, that's the best. And I'm really happy this month. I'm going to a couple different events, and half the time I go there, and it's weird because I don't know why, but in a hallway, there will be a bunch of people standing in a circle when there are perfectly good chairs somewhere, but we're standing in a circle, and I just listen and see what's going on and that whole 9 yards, and engage when I can. But a lot of times I'm just there to listen and see what's going on, because the more I know what my audience wants, the more I can give it to them.
Yeah. So you're a podcast coach. And so the conferences that you get the most value from, are they podcast conferences?
They are, but I also went to one at a library, and it's kind of a borderline tactic, but it worked. And it was for people that were learning about SEO, Well, people that are trying to understand SEO are trying to do what? Get more eyeballs to their website. Another good way to get eyeballs to your website is a podcast. And so I had a legit question, and I just walked up to the microphone at the end of the thing and I said, hey, I'm Dave Jackson. I run a website called theschoolofpodcasting.com. And that was my only pitch. And I said, and then I asked my question. And at the end, I had 4 people come up and say, did you say you do something with podcasting? And I was like, yeah, I do. And I blah, blah, oh, do you have a card? So it was a group of like 30 people. And I had like 4 people ask for business cards. I'm like, that's a pretty good return on ratio. Plus I learned about SEO while I was there. So that worked. I've gone to author events. Author's not a great fit for me. I think it should be. I think every author should have a book about their subject if it's that kind of thing. But for me, it's a matter of understanding what I'm delivering. So with, I both know podcasting is a great way to build an audience, to build a connection with your audience and things like that. So I kind of then step back and go, okay, who needs that? And then that's where I go. But yeah, podcasts, conventions are great for me. It's both. It's I'm learning about podcasting, but also my target audience is there because there are people there that are like, how do I start a podcast? And it's like, funny, you should ask.
Yeah. Quick question about that. If we are listening and we're starting a podcast or have a podcast in our niche, whatever that niche is going to be, should we attend conferences? Should we sponsor conferences? Should we try to speak at conferences? At what level do you think we ought to be focused on to like kind of grow our business and our show?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. If you want to attend, that's great. One of my favorite stories is a friend of mine, Glenn Hebert, runs a website called the Horse Radio Network. He's got like 18 shows all about horses. And there was like this, like the ultimate horse like event. And he approached them and said, I'd like to be your official podcast of your event. And here's what I'm going to do. All you have to do is give me a booth in your section, and I'm going to interview all your speakers, and we're just going to really boost the fear of missing out. Then I'm going to interview all of your vendors and say, here, you can see these at the event. We're just going to make it sound like if you're not at this horse event, you're an idiot. He goes, but all I need, I will get myself there. I will pay for my hotel. All I need is a booth in your kind of vendor area. And they're like, okay. So they gave him this little booth in the back. Now they give him the one in the front. Because what he did was he interviewed all the speakers there. That's called growing your network and getting guests for your show that came back later to do longer interviews. And he said a good 70% of the sponsors that he still has today are from that first show, because he'd be interviewing these people about, whatever, Jim's saddle shop or whatever. And they'd get done with the interview and Jim would go, so you do a what? And Glenn would go, oh, it's a podcast. And they're like, okay, well, can I sponsor that? And he's like, yeah, actually you can. Here's my rate card and that whole 9 yards. So it's a great way. Plus it kind of gives you prestige because we're the official podcast of the such and such, and you're knee deep in your target audience. And what he would do, he said it was kind of funny. He has red in his logo. So he brought 2 microphones with like little red windscreens on them. And people would walk over like, oh, this guy's got microphones. Nobody else has microphones on their little tables. What's this? Oh, here's a business card, which just has their website address and explains what it is. We do like little online radio shows for horse people. And they're like, oh, well, this is really cool. So he was also right in front of his audience getting ideas of what to talk about in the future. So that's a great way when you go to an event. I've had a lot of great interviews that have come up because of people I've met at an event. And it's one of those where you hear them and they go, oh, I did this and it really worked. And you're like, great. Do you have a card? I want to interview you later, but I don't want to pull you away from the event because you're not here to get interviewed, but I definitely want to talk to you next week when we all get home.
Yeah, I really like that. I have some follow-up questions on that. It does remind me of a story. I used to have a real estate podcast, and I went to this conference. It was called the Family Office Conference. Basically, multi-millionaires, like 100 millionaires and billionaires were there. And I thought, and my podcast, because I had a podcast, it helped me get my foot in the door in crazy ways. So I go with all these multi-millionaires, and they would get off the stage and people would come up to them. And of course it would try to flock to them and everybody would be like, hey, can I have your card? Can I have your card? And he's like, oh, I don't have a card. And I saw this happen with 3 different people that got off stage. They all pretended not to have a card with 2 or 3 or 4 different people in a row each. And then I just said, hey, I liked that thing that you said about this. And I'd love to interview you on my podcast about it, give you more exposure and get your story out. Is that something that you'd be interested in doing? And they're like, yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to do that. And they would pull out a card from I got 3 different cards from people that pretended not to have a card with lots of other people. And they would pull out a card and say, here, this is my personal cell on there. Call me and we'll get it scheduled. And it was very similar to what you're saying. Like, you've got the mics out there, or you mentioned somebody about schoolofpodcasting.com, and it will spark something, and they'll see how they can also benefit from it. Either they can leave more of a legacy, or they can maybe make more money because they get that exposure. And that's what people really want, is to help other people or to make money, or both. And you can do that for them as a podcaster. I love the story you mentioned about the sponsors, how this guy at the horse conference met all of the sponsors, and then some of them asked to sponsor his show. Do you have, has that happened to you on your podcast at all?
I walked into Podcast Movement and Dan from Focusrite said, "Are you Dave Jackson?" And I go, "Yeah," which is always kind of weird, but nobody knows what I look like because I'm a podcaster. But he goes, "Here's my card." He goes, "I want to give you some money." And I went, "Okay, you have my attention." And he's like, "I'm with Focusrite. Would you be interested in having us as a sponsor?" And I'm like, "Oh, absolutely." He's like, "Okay, well, here's my card." He goes, "Let's make this happen when you get home." So yeah, that's definitely happened. And the other thing that people do with interviews, I've seen this strategy, is I'm doing a show about some sort of industry. I interview people who should be my customer to talk about the industry. And it's kind of weird because I'm all about content. These people are kind of not as obsessed with making good content. They're more obsessed about connecting with the right people who could then give them money. So it's like, if I go to Joe Schmo CEO and say, "Hey, can I pick your brain for 20 minutes about your business?" He's going to go, "Get out of here, kid. You bother me." But if I go to that same CEO and go, "Hey, would you like to come on my podcast and talk about your company and how you grew it?" He's like, "Oh, where do I sign up?" And in both cases, it's a way to get that door open. So that's another nice benefit of podcasting. You mentioned business cards earlier. I just got this week. It looks like a business card. It's got a QR code on the back. And it's actually, if I hold this up to your phone, it will bring up a website where you can subscribe to my podcast or schedule some coaching. So business cards are always cool. And I still have regular business cards, but they're getting all high tech now. And I think QR codes are going to be the new thing. We'll see.
For the listener, he was just holding up what looks like a regular old business card, but it had a QR code on the back, his logo on the front. And if you tap the card on the back of a phone, it'll pull up all of the information.
That's why you are AAA, my friend. I appreciate that. I just realized I didn't say that when I was explaining what I was doing.
No problem. Actually, that's one of my pet peeves, if we can talk about it. There's a lot of times people will have a podcast, but during the podcast, they'll be saying things like, "See right there, look right here behind me. Do you see those 3 books?" Or whatever. And the listener is like, "What the F? What is he looking at? I'm missing out." And they're not feeling very good.
There's a guy that got paid somewhere between $100 and $200 million. And Mr. Rogan, who you get to Google things a lot in his show. He's like, "Hey," I forget what his assistant's name is. He's like, "Check into that." And so you sit there for a second, it's like, "Oh, there it is. Oh, look at that. Oh, oh my gosh, watch it. Look at that. Oh, good." And you're like, okay, I'm sitting here listening. It's like, not everybody's watching your video. Yeah. So yeah, that is a good pet peeve, my friend.
Love it. Okay. So one of the big things you talked about, 100 hours, $100, but 100 hours to figure out your listener. And I assume that you had a couple other strategies on figuring out the listener. We did talk about recon. We talked about the CD-ROM example, the focus group. We talked about Facebooks, where you go in and you use your 2 ears, 1 mouth, you listen more, you pay attention. Is there any other takeaways for studying your avatar to be able to make sure that you're providing good value and content for them?
Yeah, one of the best mistakes I ever made, I have an email list, and I went to pick 10, and I thought I had set a filter to where I could say, just send this to the last people that signed up in the last 2 months, which would have been, less than 20. And instead I sent it to my entire list. Then it said, hey, I need to pick your brain. I'm working on this new project, blah, blah, blah. We really love your opinion. Click here and schedule a Zoom meeting. This is free, blah, blah, blah. It went out to my entire list. So I spent 2 weeks talking to lots of people, 20 minutes at a time. And it was the best thing I ever did. And it was weird because people were like, what's this new thing? First of all, the idea that I was going to do, I never did because I didn't have a single person go, is that available now? Can I buy that now? Like nobody was super stoked about the idea. And I was like, all right, that's good to know. Going back to that recon. But then I would ask somebody, because in some cases, and this sounds kind of like a weird humble brag, but they'd kind of fanboy out because they're used to listening to me like, wow, that voice is coming out of your head. And I would ask them, I'm like, what do you like about my show? And they'd say something like, oh, it's always informative and you're funny and blah, blah, blah. And then I learned this trick. I'm like, great. What would you like me to either quit doing or something that's a pet peeve of yours that I do? And then I would shut up. And you end up with this weird, awkward silence that just like, and then they go, it's fine. I would not say a word until at least 3 times they're like, really, I can't think of anything. And eventually they'd be like, well, sometimes you kind of do this or that. And so it was a great way to get honest feedback from somebody. Because I'd even say, look, I brought an extra layer of skin. You're not going to hurt me today. I'm like, I'm doing the show for you and I can't make it better if you don't tell me how to fix it. And it wasn't, as always, it's hard to do that and not get defensive. Like, oh, well, I did that because I'm like, okay, good. That's I'm writing that down. So that was something I did. And it was completely by accident, but that was just simply reaching out and saying, hey, can we get on Zoom for 20 minutes? I want to talk to you. And it was kind of inspired by the pandemic, but that's what I do when I'm at events. I try to find my target audience, see what they're talking about. So that's another way to do it. And I think it's better to do it one-on-one. Would have taken a lot less time if I did a group call. But then you're going to have somebody go, well, I think this is such and such. And then you're going to have 15 people go, oh yeah, me too. And I would rather hear one at a time. So it's not a Me Too kind of situation where I can say, you know what, I've heard that 7 times now. I might want to quit doing that or things like that. So, And plus it's just, I know it sounds weird. That I know that it's just me. But when you're on a one-on-one call with, oh my gosh, the host of my favorite podcast, it's kind of a big deal. And so I think that kind of freaked him out too. It took a while, but man, I learned a lot from those phone calls or Zoom calls in this case.
I love that. But real quick side question here. How many podcasts have you started? Like for yourself, not for other people, not for your clients?
Over 30.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought so. I thought there was a few.
Yeah. And many of them never, like my favorite mistake was one called the Dates from Hell show. And I started it on a dare. Me and my now ex-wife were swapping stories. And her one friend said, this should be a podcast. And so we fired it up. And we both had like 3 stories. So that was 6 episodes. And I had this whole thing where I was going to go on all these dating sites, make a fake profile and see if I could get people to interact with me and then ask them, what's your top dates from hell kind of story? And I had a customized 800 number. I had cool theme music. I mean, I had everything. And that was the other thing. All these dating sites had affiliates. And I was like, this will be great because then we can say, hey, we met online. And it turns out that you can't make fake profiles. So that doesn't work. And then the story you're telling is how something either weird or humiliating happened to you. And the number one fear among people is speaking in public. Times that by 10 when you're saying, please humiliate yourself in public. And after a while, we started looking for stories online and we straight up just ran out of content because we had no audience. We started with no audience. We grew a very small one and asked them to contribute. And that was the end of that. Another quick one I did was I started the customer service show. One of my backgrounds is in customer service. And after about 5 episodes, I realized I just sounded like a grumpy old man. And I was like, I went into McDonald's today and they didn't even say hello. It's just like, all right. So, and it was one of those where it's like, okay, customer service is what I did. It's not who I am. And it was kind of like, I just didn't have that passion, but man, I had delusions of grandeur of like, I'm going to start this customer service show and people are going to hire me to teach it there. It's like, no. And that might've happened, but not in the 6 episodes that I did. So You start a couple and it's one of those things that's easy to do. They're like Lay's potato chips because once you get that first one done, you do know about RSS feeds and media hosts and artwork and microphones. And you think, I'll start another one. creating a podcast is not that hard. I mean, I could burp into my phone and have it in Apple by probably noon. And that's not the problem anymore. Making a good podcast is what's hard. And then it's the same with writing a book. Writing a book, you think writing the book is the hard part. It's not. Getting people to read it is the hard part. Making a podcast is really not that hard when you look back on it, but getting people to listen to it, that's where all the effort comes into play. So when you add your second podcast, you've just cut your promotion time from podcast number 1 in half. And so you end up with, let's say you do 4 podcasts, you now have 4 peanuts that you're pushing. And instead of 1 peanut going much further, you have 4 that are crawling along, said the guy that has way too many podcasts.
I love it. Awesome. Yeah, you're one of the main contributors to the statistic that podcasts don't go past 6 episodes then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are a few.
School of Podcasting, how many episodes do you have on that one?
815, I think, at this point.
On that show, because that's kind of your main business that I am aware of. On that show, do you do solo episodes, interview episodes? Do you interview your potential client? Do you interview other podcasters? What's kind of like the strategy behind what you do? How long are the episodes on that show?
It's all of the above. So some people go, should I do a solo show or should I do a interview show? When you do a solo show and you talk to one person, none of this YouTube crap of, hey guys, it's, hey, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Talk to one person. Number one, that's also going to help you if you're worried about the audience. You're freaking out. You're trying to start your podcast and you're thinking about it's like you don't have an audience yet. So let's just talk to that one person who really needs to hear your stuff. So you grow your influence when you do a solo show. When you do an interview show, you grow your network. And so do both. So that's that. And I occasionally will interview students of the School of Podcasting, especially if they're doing something cool and things like that. So I do that to give them a little promotion. Just for me, my audience is looking to how can I get more downloads? And I want to inspire them. I have a segment of my show because after a while, you kind of run out of different ways to say, seriously, would you just start a podcast? So I created a segment called Because of My Podcast. And I always just tell people, if you can answer that question because of my podcast, blank. Like mine is because of my podcast, I got hired at the New Media Expo to be their podcast guy. And people will send in stuff. I got to meet Alice Cooper because of my podcast. I met my wife, all this stuff. And so that inspires people to get them going. The length of the show is anywhere from, in the early days, it was like 15 to 20 minutes. And when I met my audience in person, the first thing they said is it needs to be longer. So I was like, man, that's a lot of Dave. And they're like, no. I'm only halfway to work by the time your show's over. I was like, okay. So it's usually now about a half hour to 40 minutes. But I did an episode once because I just got a tsunami of questions about interviews, how to be interviewed, how to do interviews, how to schedule them, how to record them. So I said, all right, I'm doing a brain dump. And I did an hour and probably 10 minutes on interviews. And I didn't have a single person say, that was too long. I did have people say I had to pull over and take notes. But there's a book called Beyond Powerful Radio by a woman named Valerie. It's a great book. And my favorite line out of the whole book is, there is no such thing as too long, only too boring. And I've run into that. I mean, Dan Carlin does 2-3 hour episodes of hardcore history. And yet when that guy puts out an episode, he breaks all the rules, by the way. He doesn't publish on a consistent basis. And there are these mammoth long episodes when he does them. And I work for Libsyn, which is a podcast media hosting company. And I was in their office once and Dan released an episode and the head IT guy came out and kind of made a joke. He's like, oh, watch, Dave, the lights are going to dim. And I go, why is that? And he goes, Dan Carlin just released an episode. And I was like, oh, okay. But I always say, whatever topic it is, I write a blog post before I actually record because I'm a little scatterbrained. And so if I can kind of flesh out, what is it I'm really trying to say? What do I want people to do? How do I want them to feel when I get done listening to this episode? So I flesh that out first. Then I write down a couple bullet points and I basically look at my invisible friend across the table and I talk to them for however long it needs to be. If it's 20 minutes, it's 20 minutes. My last episode, I think, was just under 30. And at the end, I said, hey, if you're thinking I usually do another 10 minutes here, guess what? I got nothing to say. I'm not going to waste your time. So, and I just went into it's like, I'm done. I covered what I needed to cover and we're done. We're out of here. So that's kind of my rule on length.
And out of curiosity, in your opinion, working with so many different podcasters and starting so many yourself, like, is there a rule? For example, you shared an experience where some of your avatar, your listener, said 15 to 20 minutes wasn't quite long enough for them. They're like, it needs to be longer, they said, right? Do you think that it depends on the avatar? Like, is there somebody else that might need a 5-minute avatar that just wants to get straight to a quick tidbit here and there? Or do you think kind of it's good for everyone listening to say, all right, it needs to be longer than 15 to 20 minutes?
Yeah, I heard it from multiple people, like probably 6 or 7 by the time I was done, because I was asking everybody. And so that's when you have to decide, A, does this go in alignment with your show? Because doing another 10, 20 minutes is going to take a lot more time to produce. And do I have enough time to do that and keep a consistent schedule? And if you go, no, I can't, I can only produce a 10-minute podcast, then you go, oh, I have a name for that person that just requested that. Not my target audience, because I'm looking for the person that only needs 10 minutes. If you try to be everything to everybody, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I need to quote you on that.
Yeah, I had a person, I do a show, and this was one of those shows that I started that wasn't supposed to stick around, and then it got an audience, and it did. And I basically grab random podcasts and just listen to them and just talk right off the top of my head. And so I found one, a woman in Facebook had said, I'd like some feedback on my show. And I was like, oh, awesome. So I did it. And she had a lot of things that had room for improvement. And I said it. I wasn't mean. I didn't say you suck. I'm like, okay, I don't know what you're talking about here. I'm confused. You didn't introduce what the show's about, and you didn't tell me what the episode's about. I don't know what's going on. Nobody gets on a bus unless they know where it's going. And she basically approached me and said, that was really mean, and you hurt my feelings and blah, blah, blah. And as somebody with a teaching background, that is my kryptonite. The last thing I want to do is discourage you and hurt you. And I almost stopped doing that show. And I put out an episode to my audience, right? When in doubt, ask your audience. I said, hey, this is a special episode. Here's what's going on. Would you still listen if this was a kinder, gentler version of the show? And they said, what are you talking about? You give honest, constructive feedback. Don't let this one person dictate, like, I'm sorry that she's upset, but no, we're here to learn how to do better podcasting. Don't stop the show. And I was like, okay. So, and again, that was based on about 20 people that said, oh, good God, please don't stop this show. But I had one person that maybe has a little different tolerance, and I'm not judging. It's just, that's what it was. So you want to make sure any changes to the show are based on more than one person. And I did tell them, I said, I am going to rebrand it because it was, again, it's a fake show. It wasn't supposed to last. I'm going to rebrand it with a better name and we'll move on.
Yeah. I had a podcast about real estate a while back. I think I sold it a little over 2 years ago, but when I had that show, it had a whole bunch of 5-star reviews. And then I got like 2 reviews. One was like a 1-star and then either like a 2 or a 3-star. And they both hurt my feelings. Like, I don't know what it is when you're the host, and this kind of goes along with what you're saying. Like, I remembered the negative reviews. I thought about the negative reviews. All the positive reviews, it was like, to me, it meant nothing because anyone can say nice stuff. We're taught that we're supposed to say nice stuff. And so I let hundreds of positive reviews out of my mind because these like 1 or 2. And actually in my heart, I had a lot of anxiety, a lot of like, I've got to change my whole show because one person said something like, it's not about what the title is about, right? Not the episode, but it was called Creative Real Estate Podcast. And they said, I talk too much about buying apartments and not like lease option subject to wraparound mortgage and some of these other creative financing types of real estate. And that hit me. And I'm like, I've got to change my whole show. And it goes to what you were saying. Like, I brought this up at a conference that I was speaking at about real estate back then. And everybody's like, no, I love your podcast. I want it to be about these things. And I'm like, well, you don't think I need to change it and make sure I have? They're like, no. And so, yeah, first off, Dave, how do you freaking get over this stuff? Because it was not easy for me. And when our listener has their first or second negative review, like 3, 2, or 1 star.
Right.
How do they get past that?
I love the fact that you quoted the one, because mine is a bad commercial for a bad product, 1 star. That was the review. I can quote that like it's scripture. Now, ask me to quote one of the good ones. Can't do it. So that's normal. I think that's kind of like I said before. I just have to realize that person is not my target audience, and you're not going to be liked by everyone. I know some people are like, well, if I put myself out there, I'm going to be judged. I go, have you gone to Walmart in the past month? And they're like, yeah. And I go, guess what? You've been judged. The person standing behind you was looking at what was in your cart. I said, you are judged everywhere you go. It's what we do. Turn on half the TV shows now. What is it? You're being judged, and it's world's best muffin or whatever. It's like, that's what we do. We judge. So don't worry about it. And the other thing you can do is when you do get that email that says, hey, Dave, I just found your show. I want to let you know that I was going to kill myself, but your podcast gave me hope. And I didn't kill myself. And I just want to let you know, I credit you with saving my life. Save that. I have a folder in Gmail. Anytime you get anything that's like, hey, that was so cool and blah, blah, because there are going to be days when you're like, time to make the podcast. I don't know what I'm going to talk. And then you're like, why am I even doing this? Nobody's listening. The negative voices have taken over in your head. Go to that folder and you're like, oh, that's right. There's these people that are listening. And so it's not easy. It really isn't. But that's where I always tell people that if you looking at your stats does not make them grow, and yet we spend way more time looking at our stats, I go stare at your audience and find out what they want.
Wait. Where's
another bumper sticker?
Can I clap?
Yeah. There we go.
Jeez, that was good. Drop the mic. Yeah, another bumper sticker. I love that.
Yeah, as someone who works at Libsyn, the person that is obsessing over their stats, the more they obsess, the less stats they have. Like the person that's like, there's got to be something wrong. And you go and you're like, they're getting 12 downloads an episode. And I was like, yeah, you need to go look at your audience.
Yeah.
So, but it's hard when you first start out. You're like, because you're still freaking out that anybody's listening. So
that resonates so much, Dave. I love that. All right. I do have one more question, and it's just about repeating content. And the reason I ask it is because there's a lot of clients that I've worked with, and I'm sure you as well. They're new podcasters. They're coming into it and they have things holding them back because they don't know if they have enough content to even start a podcast. They're like, I'll run out of stuff in 6 episodes. And others are, for example, like always are wanting to go, okay, they're the host and they've done some 101s, basic stuff, and they got bored with that. So now they're going to the 202 basic stuff or 301s, 401s, 501s. And they're just trying to just get so much, and it kind of goes over people's heads. And then there's other podcasters that have, like, for example, not that Dave, I don't remember his other, Ramsey only does podcasts. He does others as well. But he basically has like 5 ideas and he just regurgitates them over and over and over. So like in your opinion, as you're coaching somebody, and let's pretend our listener is your student right now, you're coaching him or her to have a podcast. Do they repeat content? Do they not repeat content? Once they tell about a $99 mic, they can't ever say that again. What does that kind of look like in your opinion?
Yeah, for me, I did one. Oh, I can't even remember what it was. Probably a couple months ago. And I was like, I think I've already talked about this. And when you're into 800 episodes, you're like, I think I've already talked about everything. But I looked at it and I said, oh, you know what? I have new insights now. I can add this to it. And I did that. So that's something that I kind of look at. Like, okay, I've talked about SEO or microphones or whatever. I can talk about this because there's a new product. That's the other thing. Hopefully there's news in your industry that you can talk about. In some cases, I will hijack the news. So a few years ago, Muhammad Ali died. And when he died, like that was one of my heroes growing up. Like Nixon was president, Muhammad Ali was the world boxing champion. And the guy was such a character. So I turned it into an episode about podcasting. I said, here's like 10 things every podcaster can listen, or every podcast can learn from Muhammad Ali. Number one, he was really unique. He found a unique edge. He was constantly promoting himself. He was, and blah, blah. And I just went through. So I was still talking podcasting, but I was also sharing a little bit about myself. And I had my listeners email me like, hey, he was my champ too, buddy. So that's something you can do. You can kind of hijack the news. I did the same thing when Robin Williams died. For a while, it was just like, are you just looking at the obituaries, looking for new episodes, or what's going on? So yeah, I try not to repeat it. And if I do, it's because I have new insights. Like I'm doing my next episode will be about wacky ways to grow your audience. Well, I did one episode. It's like, here's 30 ways, here's 30 strategies to grow your audience. And this one is basically going back to how do I grow my audience? But it's weird things like putting business cards in books at Barnes and Noble that are based on your topic. Now I'm not going to get a ton of downloads doing that, but if you've done everything else, I used to do that when I traveled. I'd be like, oh, I'm bored. And I'd look across the street. I'm like, oh, there's a bookstore across the street. Let's go over there and spam some books and that kind of thing. So the one that I kind of go, is when somebody goes, hey, thanks so much for tuning in. This is a replay of episode 36. Because I'm like, well, wait a minute. If you subscribe to a podcast, I already had access to episode 36. I didn't need you to push it to the top of the list. So I think if you can bring new insights, or if before it was a solo show and now it's an interview show, football is all about tackling and passing and things like that. And every now and then you want to kind of go back and go, yeah, we need to talk about tackling again.
Do you like calling back to other episodes? Like, for example, you were talking about the wacky ways. Mm-hmm. On that episode, did you say, go back to episode, let's say 700. I don't know the number, but go back to episode 700 and that'll give you 30 ways. If you want more, go back to 700. Do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And there will be a link to that episode in the show notes.
Oh, I love that.
Because anything you mention that's clickable, I asked my audience once, I'm like, what do you want in show notes? And they're like, a paragraph to let me know what I'm getting into. And then anything you mention, whether it's a book or a guest website or whatever, if it's something I want to dig deeper into, please don't make me go to Google and search for it. Just put it in the show notes.
Yeah. I love that. Speaking of that, Reddit will be in our show notes because we talked about Reddit, Facebook, YouTube. These things will all be in there. Man, I just love your wisdom, your experience, and the way that you deliver content. And so if you're listening and you want more of this, Dave Jackson's got the School of Podcasting podcast. Scroll down. The link's already in the show notes. Some of my takeaways was you spend just $100 on a mic and 100 hours figuring out your listener. Another thing that I wrote down was that don't make it hard for people to kind of like find your podcast. Like if they say, I've got a podcast, maybe put that link in your Facebook profile, for example, because you don't want to lose a listener. You don't want to make it difficult or challenging for them to find it. So put that info wherever you can. And you talked about Muhammad Ali as well, being a self-promoter and it being okay. And that's how we need to be as well. We need to be like, all right, having our website. We're maybe not forcing anything down somebody's throat, but at the same time, we're definitely at least letting them do the thing that they want to do if they're looking for it. The focus group was a big takeaway, doing your recon, like your CD-ROM example. The Facebook group going in to listen, not necessarily just spam and tell, but to listen, to learn. YouTube being brutal, being a good place to get reviews. Reddit being another place. The horse conference story where your friend ended up getting a free booth because he worked something out with them. Strategy to interview your customers being a good way to find new customers. That big, massive email that you accidentally sent to everybody, but how valuable it was to you. The takeaways that I got was very personalized. It wasn't like, hey, all of you, if you would like to do this thing, blah, 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 here's this. It was more like, I wanted to reach out to you to get your opinion. Just like when you were talking about speaking to your audience, you're going to talk to that one person. It's you, not you guys. It's not you all, not my listeners. It's my listener, the person that's in with their earbuds on right now with us. Man, and then one of my favorite parts is you wanting to know like the bad stuff about your podcast. Everybody wants to know the good stuff, but you specifically, when you're talking to those people, saying like, what am I doing wrong? What do you want me to change? Is there a pet peeve that I do? Go ahead, Dave. I can see.
I'm dying to say this. There's always room for improvement. I am horrible at doing video interviews because half the time, instead of talking to you, I'm looking at Adam on the screen. I'll go back and watch this. I'm like, oh, you weren't looking at the camera. So there's always room for improvement.
With that said, I put my webcam exactly over where I put your face. So I am probably looking underneath the person who's viewing. But yeah, I always put my webcam right there. I feel like it helps you know that I'm connecting with you. You see my facial expressions. I think there's a lot to it on that subject. And I know we're like at that time where we need to wrap it completely up. But on that subject, there's this thought of a lot of people say, I'm only going to do an audio only, so I'm not going to record with a video. And I'm against that. I'm like, you're going to get so much more if you can look at that person in the eye. That's just me personally. So even if I'm doing audio only, I'm going to still have the video going. I still want to see my guest with me on that. And then just the insights that you had about the length of an episode. And I loved how you talked about kind of getting your thoughts together by writing a blog post first and being able to kind of go through that. And man, just so many good things. And I really appreciate you coming on our show. I'll definitely have you back. Dave's info is in the show notes. Please scroll down. That's where you'll find his podcast and some of the things that we talked about in this episode. I'll see you on the next one.
Thank you so much, man. This was great.
By the way, one way to ensure that you don't miss out on great content that we're producing on a regular basis is to make sure you're subscribed to the show. You need to be subscribed or following the Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to it in order not to miss all of that. And before I let you go, I need to mention, because a lot of people are asking, do you help? Can you help me with this? And the answer is yes. My company actually does it. It's called Grow Your Show. And you can find that at growyourshow.com. Our clients, they call us the easy button for podcaster because they simply have to record their episode. And they know that every single thing else is done for them. We sweat the hard stuff so you can be the star of your show. And if you would like help to make sure that we're editing and publishing and promoting and doing your social media, it's all in one place. And I think it's pretty affordable. You'll have to take a look for yourself. Just go to growyourshow.com and check us out. And by the way, I'll see you on the next episode.